the middle of a revolution because I see the face of things to come. Yes, I do. Oh, your Constitution. Well, my friend, it's gonna have to bend. I'm here to tell you about the destruction of all the evil it will have to end.
You're listening to Socialist News and Views with your host, Nick Schillingford, on Liberty and Justice Radio Network, LNJ Radio. Welcome to Socialist News and Views, episode 12, coming to you from the Urban Cabin Studios in South Minneapolis. In the second half of the show, we will hear from Brad, a local activist, talking about Maoism. In the first half of the show, obviously, we will start with news, beginning with local news. According to City Page's blog, in an item entitled Minneapolis Settles Police Misconduct Case for $3 million, May 28th, it says the payout went to, quote, the family of Davis Cornelius Smith, a 28-year-old who died in 2010 after an incident with police officers at the downtown YMCA, end quote. The article says in 2010, cops tased Smith multiple times, and according to the federal lawsuit filed by the family, then, quote, the officers detained Smith using a controversial tactic called prone restraint, a hold in which an officer applies pressure to the individual's back, making it difficult for the person to take in oxygen, end quote. And the cycle of racist police brutality and murder goes on without being checked. May 31st, Minnesota Public Radio News says, quote, hundreds marched through downtown Minneapolis Friday evening to protest police actions in the death of Terrence Franklin, end quote. Fight Back News writes June 1st, quote, they demanded that the police be prosecuted for killing Franklin, who was unarmed, and that an independent investigation be carried out. Franklin was shot multiple times in the back of his head and in his back, in the basement of a house on 27th Street and Bryant Avenue South, end quote. Ty Moore, who is running as a socialist alternative candidate for Minneapolis City Council, spoke at the rally and march.
We want an independent investigation.
Yes, we do.
We do not trust the police department to investigate itself. If we know that history, then it doesn't work. There's a culture of impunity. There's a culture of corruption, of lies. And it's not unique to Minneapolis. It's true of every major city police department in this country. And it's been true throughout U.S. history.
Retail janitorial workers with local organizations say Tool have called for a strike action starting this month. According to a meme on Facebook, they have, quote, set a June 10th deadline for a strike, end quote. They are calling for supporters to join them on the picket line Tuesday, May 11th from 6 to 10 a.m. in front of the downtown Target store at 900 Nicollet Avenue. They will also have a concert for justice featuring local artists from 4 to 7 p.m. that night. In national news, the May 2013 edition of The Internationalist at internationalist.org has an article called Immigration Reform, the Big Swindle, in which it says that many aspects of the recent bipartisan plan are not getting discussed. The article says, quote, many people are aware of the basics, end quote, but goes on to say, quote, but there are a couple of hitches which most people are unaware of. A, undocumented immigrants initially receive only 6 years in provisional status, then have to apply again, and to get a second period, their income must have been above the poverty level all 6 years, and they cannot have been unemployed for more than 60 consecutive days. This would exclude many in seasonal occupations such as construction. And then, B, after 10 years, there is a big barrier. Their income must have been at least 25% above official poverty level for all 10 years, end quote. It says this means, quote, millions of undocumented immigrants would not be eligible to receive a green card and eventually citizenship, even if they met all other criteria, end quote. They also mention the increased militarization of the border included in the bill and have a handy infographic that depicts the, quote, immigration reform maze, end quote. Walmart workers' first ever prolonged strike. The Nation reports May 28th saying that workers will walk off in Miami, Massachusetts, and the California Bay Area, among other locations, saying that the labor group Our Walmart says that, quote, at least 100 workers have pledged to join the strike and that some workers walking off the job today will stay out at least through June 7th, end quote. That is the day of this show's airing, meaning that workers have been off the job for over a week as of today. On the environmental side of the capitalist wasteland that is Walmart, the company has also pled guilty to dumping hazardous waste in rivers in California, according to Talking Point's memo. The company will simply pay a fine as a cost of doing business, and unlike the working people that find themselves under the crushing weight of an ever more punishing police state in the U.S., no executives will receive any charges or jail time for using our public environment as their own personal dumping ground. Activists, artist, and previous guest on Socialist News and Views, Ryan Williams-Verdon, writes a blog post at ryanwilliamsverdon.com called Undermining the Social Order. Yes, please. In the May 31st post, Williams-Verdon writes that an all-male panel, including Lou Dobbs, quote, "we're up in arms," end quote, in response to a new Pew study revealing that 4 out of 10 women are the primary moneymakers in their household. The post goes on, saying, quote, Juan Williams even declared it was, quote unquote, devastating minority families worse, end quote. And another on the panel said it was undermining the social order. As Williams-Verdon notes, the end of slavery, the civil rights movement, the union movement all undermined the social order. Towards the end of the blog saying, quote, "this is no different. Our social order can use the undermining." Then perhaps Juan Williams, instead of blaming the rise of women for the damage to black families, could turn his attention to the real cause, racism, i.e. Reagan's war on drugs, mass incarceration, or the fact that slave families were torn apart to help guarantee the survival of the institutions and that social order, end quote. He ends saying, quote, "bring on the undermining." In international news, May 28th, the Committee for Workers International publishes an article called The Reality of Swedish Neoliberalism from Per Olsson of the CWI Sweden. The article says, quote, "the old Swedish model is no more. Instead, Sweden has become a model of neoliberalism. It has had a more rapid liberalization than any other advanced economy in the world in terms of privatization and deregulation. This was the conclusion of the American think tank, the Heritage Foundation, last year," end quote. The article outlines the effect of the 2008 economic crisis on Sweden, including the looting of healthcare, education, and other services by having them run by private entities. The article says that in response to right-wing neoliberal attacks on public-run services, the Swedish section of the CWI has helped create the Welfare Without Profit campaign. It says, quote, "the campaign for public welfare is a struggle against decaying capitalism that regards further privatization as an article of faith. It is a struggle to overthrow the old parasitic capitalist system and to replace it with a democratic socialist society." May 3rd, Japan Daily Press reports that 60,000 took to the streets in Tokyo to protest Japan's plan to restart nuclear power production. This is smaller than the July 2012 protest of 170,000, also against restarting nuclear. According to the article, the organizers of the recent event said, quote, "they have collected over 8 million signatures of those opposed to reactor restarts," end quote. In Turkey, a protest that started to protect a park from being turned into a mall has escalated into a pro-democracy mass movement spanning multiple cities in the country with large amounts of popular support. The Guardian website, May 31st, published an article called "Istanbul Park Protests Sow the Seeds of a Turkish Spring." Sungar Savran writes for the Bullet Socialist Project June 1st in a report from Turkey, quote, "Istanbul has become a battlefield covered by tear gas. The police, no doubt at the behest of the Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan and his AKP government, have been attacking protesters in the center of the city near Taksim Square for 5 consecutive days. This would have been no news at all. Turkish police are famous for their brutality in dealing with demonstrations," end quote. Going on to say, quote, "the difference lies in the determination and audacity of the protesters," end quote. According to June 3rd, socialistworker.org, in an article entitled "Spring Comes to Turkey," Tom Gagney writes, "the cry of the demonstrators has become, quote, Tayyip istifa, resign Tayyip." Referring to, quote, Tayyip Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey and head of the conservative Islamist-influenced Justice and Development Party, AKP, end quote. The article says Erdogan has been at the forefront of a neoliberal reinvention of Turkey. This has included the nearly complete privatization of nationalized industries, the rise of Turkey as a regional power with its sights set on domination of natural resources in the Mediterranean, and the utter destruction of ancient Byzantine and Ottoman neighborhoods in Istanbul, Turkey's largest city, in the name of urban renewal and gentrification, with the goal of turning Istanbul into a major financial center, end quote. Also, June 3rd, the IMT, International Marxist Tendency, has an article called Turkey, Mass Movement Against Government, General Strike Needed, by Jorge Martin. Although some large actions had been called at the time of the article's writing, it argues a broad general strike is the next necessary step. As of June 5th, KESK and DISK, two of the largest unions, had called for a general strike. Martin writes, quote, "The movement so far has been largely spontaneous in nature, as it could not be otherwise. It developed extremely quickly from a small protest of 50 people to a mass movement, which now involves probably millions in one way or another. It has also united different sections of society and different national groups and minorities. This is its strength. However, the movement cannot remain at this level if it is to move forward," end quote. The article ends talking about Turkey's strong working class and saying, quote, "If there were a revolutionary leadership with roots in the working class, we would be on the eve of a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism in Turkey," end quote. That's all the news. Now we go to a song. The song was requested by our interviewee, who will be speaking to us in the second half of the show. The song is by Amiri Baraka, and Brad, who we talked to in the second half of the show, said in a message after the interview that it just shows how far into the mainstream revolutionary communism got in the 70s that a world-famous writer, Amiri Baraka, would do this song, together with musicians from the Commodores, Parliament, and Kool and the Gang. Have a listen.
Let's go, On Socialist News and Views, we let folks introduce themselves, so I'll let you introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. My name's Brad, and I'm here to talk about Maoism.
So first off, I guess what is, I've heard the term Maoism before, but I'm not sure that I have a clear idea of what it is. How would you describe Maoism to listeners?
I think I'd start just by saying, Maoism is named after Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Chinese Revolution. One time someone asked him what Marxism boils down to, and he said it really boils down to one thing, that it's right to rebel against reactionaries. So that's sort of a short answer, but it obviously encompasses a lot more than that. Maoism, I would say, I use the term Marxism-Leninism, but I understand why people would say Maoism for groups that take inspiration from Mao in China. I would say it's the ideology of working class revolution in the era that we're in now, the era of imperialism and socialist construction. That's another sort of short answer. I would basically say for anyone who looks around the world and sees all of the damage that capitalism is doing, and is looking for another, people say another world's possible, and it is, but the question is, how do you create that other world?
Right.
And I think you judge by the practice of the last 100 years have been, if you look throughout human history, that we know, recorded human history, there have been more revolutions in the last 100 years than at any other time, right? And so we have a lot of material to work with to look at what works and what doesn't in practice, and learn lessons from that. And so I think that's where I start and look and trying to figure out how to create that other world that's possible. And that's how I came to Marxism-Leninism and to Mao and his contributions.
So you say Marxism, Leninism, and then taking some ideas from Mao. Have different groups kind of taken those ideas differently or acted on them differently, and what different groups exist right now in those traditions?
Well, there's around the world and there's in the U.S. I suppose those are very different discussions, but related obviously. I think if you look around the world, there are countries that China, Vietnam, Korea, Cuba, and Laos are 5 countries that had socialist revolutions and still use Marxism-Leninism, and there are obviously a lot of debates about the merits and problems and contradictions in those countries, but I'm one who believes that those are still socialist countries that are dealing with a lot of internal contradictions, still surrounded by imperialism, etc. But I think if you look in China, Mao is still studied and his contributions are still valued, and as likewise in Vietnam, and I know less about Laos, but clearly throughout Asia, Marxism-Leninism and the contributions of Mao are still very much alive.
Right.
And I think also Cuba and as well, Marxism-Leninism is very much alive. I think in countries where there's still capitalism and countries that are still colonized and oppressed, if you look at the revolutionary movements in those countries, I think the largest and the most advanced ones that exist now that I know of are either call themselves Maoists or Marxist-Leninists, for example, in India, where there's a huge armed movement, the Communist Party of India, Maoist. It's Maoist, it says in their name, right? In Nepal, where the Maoists, who recently split, and so it's more complicated now, but they were on the verge of revolution in Nepal and got right up to the precipice and then split, and now there's differences over how do you do that in today's world. But they call themselves Maoists. In Turkey, in the Philippines, there are very substantive movements that are fighting to end capitalism and start to build socialism.
Right. There's clearly a large group of people in the world that consider themselves to be Maoists or Marxist-Leninists.
Right.
So what's the tradition of Maoism or Marxism-Leninism in the United States? You talked a bit about the world.
Right. In the U.S., I think it's also interesting that, as we know, in looking around today, the left is smaller than we would all like and weaker than we'd all like. But I think, when I first started to get active in politics and started to look at the history of the movements in the U.S., I started looking at the 1960s, and the groups that inspired me the most when I started learning about it, like the Black Panthers, and then like SDS, Students for Democratic Society, especially at the end, the last few years, and then the groups that sort of grew out of those movements when they imploded in the 70s, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and all kinds of groups that were called the New Communist Movement in the 70s. That it just sort of occurred to me like, wow, these are all groups that were basically inspired by Mao and by what was going on in China. I mean, the Black Panthers, you just can't understand the Black Panthers without understanding Mao. If you read their I forget, it's like the 8 points of attention and the rules of the party, it's just like word for word from the Chinese People's Liberation Army. It's like just copied,
Right.
They studied the Mao's Little Red Book as their sort of initial political education.
Right.
So I think within the U.S., in sort of recent U.S. history, in that last sort of large upsurge of the left in the 60s and 70s, I think Marxism, Leninism, and particularly those influenced by Mao, are the forces that I'm the most inspired by and interested in terms of what they were able to accomplish in the society, and in terms of efforts of, there was the student movement, right, and then a lot of the students from the student movement, as they became Marxists, decided to go to the working class, right. And give up whatever professional careers might await them on their university track and go take working class jobs. And there's a lot of stuff from the 70s, and people are just starting to sort of write more about it now, and I find that stuff very inspiring.
Absolutely, and I, just recently I've seen like Black Power Mixtape is one that came out, and then Free Angela Davis and All Political Prisoners. I just saw that when it was came to the theater the other night, and there's so much stuff in there that has not really even come to light, and especially with Black Power Mixtape, when you look at what was going on in the United States from like the outside, it really did it looked like a civil war almost to some extent. Like the level of violence by the state was something you don't really hear about a lot these days, but it was so intense that it really did have that feel. I think the videographers in Black Power Mixtape were from Sweden, and it really did look like a civil war the way that they showed some of the footage as far as what was going on in this country at the time. So
yeah, and I think if you look at those movements in the 60s that emerged, the context they emerged in was, right, there's the old Communist Party USA, which still existed and still exists today, that was pro-Soviet Union, and so you just ask the question, like, why did all these new movements that emerged in the U.S. not relate to that? There was this tradition in the 30s, they had like 100,000 members, what happened, and why didn't they sort of benefit from or help lead these new upsurges? And there's, like everything, it's complicated, right? I think the McCarthyist repression really walloped the Communist Party here, and they were still reeling from that. I mean, when the movements of the 60s emerged, like when the Civil Rights Movement really emerged in the mid-50s, through the mid-60s, they were still, their leaders were still in jail and in exile and in hiding, and so that was hard for them to take advantage of the new wave of activity. But it was also a political question that what happened at that time. Khrushchev was the leader in the Soviet Union, and in this is sort of arcane historic footnotes at this point, but I think politically important, on some level too, that Khrushchev started the Soviet Union on a different course that was basically reformist or revisionist, where he introduced these concepts of the peaceful transition to socialism and peaceful coexistence with capitalism. And so in that context, the Chinese Revolution had happened recently, and Mao and the Communist Party in China looked at these things coming out of the Soviet Union, and they were like, that's not quite right. We don't want to peacefully coexist with capitalism. Right. If you understand dialectics, it's you can't peacefully coexist. Exactly. There's a contradiction, and we support revolution, and let's go. And so when people here started to get active and look around the world at what inspires us and what can help us figure out what to do, they saw China saying, and like China was putting out statements supporting the Black Liberation Movement in the U.S. and was sending troops and arms to Korea, and was sending arms to Vietnam, and had this sort of continue the revolution thing, whereas the Soviet Union was advising the Communist Party USA and other parties in their orbit to just do the electoral stuff. Sort of missed the wave of militancy that was coming. So,
True.
So I think that's some of the context of why a lot of the leadership and a lot of the base of those movements in the 60s, and as things turned into the 70s, turned more towards China and towards Mao and towards that ideologically.
And so yeah, I hope to have lots of listeners globally, but I would say probably right now the likelihood is that most of them are locally, or at least in the United States. And so, what would you tell people about the relevance of Maoism or Marxism, Leninism, and how they can apply it specifically within the United States today? Like, what lessons can they take, and where can they go with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Marxism is Marx analyzed capitalism, and his analysis of capitalism is still true, and I think, and also supported revolution, and the term that scares a lot of people, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, the workers having the right to rule. And I think that's still relevant. I think Lenin led the first socialist revolution in a country that succeeded in actually overthrowing capitalism and starting to build something new. And I think that those lessons are still relevant. I think Lenin also brought Marxism out of early capitalism into the era of imperialism, where whole countries were taken by the capitalists, and those contributions are still true. I think Mao led the revolution in China, which is the most populous country on the planet, and brought Marxism out of Europe and into the rest of the world, which is where the majority of the people of the world live. And that inspired a wave of revolutions around Asia and Africa, and to some degree in Latin America, and inspired movements within the imperialist countries too, in the U.S. and Europe. So I think all the things that Maoism or Marxism-Leninism were based on are still true, and so I think it is still relevant and analyzes reality as better than anything else that I've seen.
True.
And that's what really we should be about, is figuring out what tools can help us understand reality so we can change it.
Absolutely.
And so there are, sort of a fundamental insight of Marxism is that, theory and practice, you can't just have one or just the other. You need to have theory that guides practice. So obviously learning and reading and studying about politics and these ideologies and this history is important, but there are thousands of people who spend thousands of hours in universities just studying this stuff, and they may come up with some great stuff, but if you don't apply that in practice, then you're missing half of the equation. And so I think getting organized is really the key for if you want to figure out how to make a contribution to ending capitalism, trying to build towards socialism. I think checking out organizations that are around is key. I think, as I mentioned, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of collectives and organizations formed that were communists. Out of those groups, several of them merged in the mid-'80s into a group called Freedom Road Socialist Organization.
Okay.
And that's the group that I'm the most partial to, and I would encourage people to check it out. And the website to check out if people are interested is there's basically a news website that is updated pretty much daily, fightbacknews.org, and then the organization's website is frso.org. I think that's the place to start. Check out the organizations that exist, and no organization is perfect, but I think I would appeal to folks to find the organization that's closest to what you believe, and get involved and make your contribution.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking about Maoism with me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, some folks are gonna get the notion, I know. They'll say I'm preaching hate. Hey, but if I have to swim the ocean, well, I will, just to communicate. It's not as simple as talking jive, the daily struggle just to stay alive.
This has been another edition of Socialist News and Views with your host, Nick Schillingford, on Liberty and Justice Radio Network, LNJ Radio.